Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope that the day so far has been fruitful for you. And again, thank you for coming on this beautiful April morning and early afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce Reverend Kimberly Cosan Fleury. Kimberly is a ubiquitous presence around town, involved in many, many different social and environmental justice organizations and activities. Kimberly is a member of the board of Hoosier Interfaith Power and Light. She's one of the leaders of the Northeast Indiana Poor People's Campaign, and she's a Kingian nonviolence facilitator. And I've asked Kimberly to introduce our guest for the afternoon.
Thank you. It's indeed an honor to be with each of you and to welcome the Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris to our midst to speak truth and to urge us into the now of justice and for all. I first met Liz Theo Harris on a bitter cold couple of days in January of 2019 in Indianapolis as she joined a small team of people to revitalize the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival in Indiana. I had taken part in some Moral Monday actions and was following the campaign, so already knew she was a brilliant thinker and biblical scholar. Then, in person multiple times in 2019, I got to witness her love of people, her tenacity, and her passion for justice and meaningful statistics. Liz Theo Harris is co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, with alongside the Reverend Dr. William Barber II. She is the director of the Cairo Center for Religion, Rights, and Social Justice and teaches at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. She's an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA. Reverend Dr. Theo Harris is editor of We Cry Justice, Reading the Bible with the Poor People's Campaign. It is on sale in the next room. She's the author of Always With Us, What Jesus Really Said About the Poor, and co-author of Revive Us Again, Vision and Action in Moral Organizing. As a Kingian nonviolence facilitator, the campaign has been integral in me witnessing what this work of continuing the campaign that King and so many others started 50 years ago, because she is a living example of it. Last year, she was awarded the Freedom Award by the National Civil Rights Museum for the Poor People's Campaign work. In 2020, she was named one of 15 faith leaders to watch by the Center for American Progress. She is a Selma Bridge Award recipient and named one of 11 women shaping the church by Sojourners, and was named one of Politico 50 thinkers, doers, and visionaries whose ideas are driving politics. God help us, I hope so. May it come to fruition. Reverend Dr. Theo Harris received her BA in Urban Studies from the University of Pennsylvania, her MDiv and PhD from Union Theological Seminary. I wanted to invite one of our tri-chairs of the Indiana Poor People's Campaign for a way of engaging us, Patty Sailing, in song, because we are all a part of this. We're so honored that Liz is with us, but she is with us because we are together and we are moving forward together, and it takes momentum and numbers and people of heart and moral conviction. And so one of those people of much heart is Patty, and we are going to sing our way into community before we welcome Liz to the stage.
Awesome. Thank you. It's great to be here with all y'all. Great to be with Reverend Liz. And yeah, like Reverend Kimberly said, we know that it's important to put our power and our pain and our resolve on full display in all of its beauty, in all of its grandeur. And one of the things I always like to tell folks when we're about to sing is that you have a duty to look out for your neighbor in all kinds of ways, right? You believe that? You got a duty to look out for your neighbor? Well, one of the ways you can look out for them today is singing loud enough so that they don't have to hear themselves. And then you can trust that they'll do the same for you. So that way, if you both sing loud enough, then no one has to hear how they sound, because you just get to hear how we sound. And I'll tell you, it's something transformative to hear how we sound and to imagine where we can take that sound. So in our movement, we know that we ground ourselves in the songs that we sing and that we've been singing for generations. And one of those songs is entitled "Somebody is Hurting My Brother," my sibling, my sister. And so I'm going to teach it to you real quick. You've already got it in your hearts. You'll figure out the lyrics and the rhythm, and we'll get into step, and we'll feel that. So first, I'll just talk through it. So we'll say that, and I want you to just repeat back to me, all right? Somebody is hurting our family.
Somebody is hurting our family.
And it's gone on
And it's gone on
far too long.
far too long.
Far too long.
Far too long.
I want you to hold on to that part. I really want to hear y'all on that far too long. You can sing every bit, but you really got to hit that far too long. I need to know that you feel how long it's been. So say it one more time. How long has it been?
Far too long.
That's right. Somebody's hurting our family, and it's gone on far too long. Yes, it's gone on
Far too long.
I tell you it's gone on.
Far too long.
Somebody's hurting our family, and it's gone on
Far too long.
and we won't be silent anymore. Say that last part again. And we won't be silent anymore. Not being silent can sound a little louder, so I want to hear it on the next one. Did you hear somebody's poison in the water? And it's gone on.
Far too long.
Yes, it's gone on.
Far too long.
I tell you it's gone on.
Far too long.
Somebody's poison in the water, and it's gone on far too long, and we won't be silent anymore. Somebody's hurting our brother, and it's gone on far too long. Yes, it's gone on far too long. I tell you it's gone on far too long. Somebody's hurting our fisting, and it's gone on far too long, and we won't be silent anymore. We'll do one more. Someone's hurting our family. Did you hear somebody's hurting our family, and it's gone on far too long. Yes, it's gone on far too long. I tell you it's gone on far too long. Somebody's hurting our family, and it's gone on far too long, and we won't be silent anymore. Say that again. And we won't be silent anymore. Yeah, that's right. Feel it. Yeah. And now look at your neighbor that sang loud enough for you and tell them that we won't be silent anymore. Now look to that other neighbor and tell them we won't be silent anymore. Go ahead and tell them you love them too. And I'll tell you, I love you. Appreciate y'all.
Oh, so much love to Patty and to Crystal Durrell, our hometown organizer for the whole state. These rock stars are making it so that you'll be on the bus and in the program and online joining this campaign. So thanks to the amazing, beautiful Indiana Poor People's Campaign. And welcome, Liz, for your way to show up for environmental justice and to call us into the same action.
Yeah, let's give it up for all of us. That was beautiful, and you sounded amazing. And thanks, Patty, for putting yourself out there and helping to bring about the spirit in this space. So I want to thank the Indiana Poor People's Campaign. I want to thank Michael Spath. I want to thank Plymouth Church and everybody that's a part of the Center for Middle East Peace for this invitation and for this conference. And I want to speak to you all about earth justice, economic justice, racial justice, and peace justice, and what I believe it's going to take for us to realize that. As some of you might know, the last campaign that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was building was the Poor People's Campaign. Back in 1967 and 68, he proposed that uniting and organizing thousands of poor people from all across the country into a force to be reckoned with would be the Achilles heel, the weak point of a system of racism and poverty and militarism. And he said that we needed to unite millions of poor people across race and geography and issue into a campaign to lift the load of poverty. He came out with the Poor People's Campaign right when he came out against the war in Vietnam. And he said that all war, including that war, was an enemy of the poor, and that it would take pulling poor people together to stop this cruel manipulation of the poor. Shortly before he was killed, he shared some remarks that I think are really appropriate for Earth Day. As a Christian preacher, he said, "God has left enough and to spare in this world for all his children to have the basic necessities of life. God never intended for some of his children to live in inordinate, superfluous wealth, while others live in abject, deadening poverty. And somehow I believe that God made it all. I believe firmly that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. I don't think it belongs to Mr. Rockefeller. I don't think it belongs to Mr. Ford. I think the earth is the Lord's. And since we didn't make these things by ourselves, we must share them with others. I think this is the only way we are going to solve the basic problems, the restructuring of our society, which I think is so desperately needed. Now today, in 2022, if we were to exchange Mr. Musk and Mr. Bezos for Mr. Rockefeller and Mr. Ford, although a little controversial, these words seem to really fit. If we look at what's going on, there are 140 million people who are poor and low income. Nearly 100 million without health care or adequate health care, tens of millions on the verge of eviction, extreme storms wreaking havoc on lives and livelihoods, a growing Christian nationalist movement in this, the richest country in human history. A report by the Institute for Policy Studies and the Americans for Tax Fairness put it this way: never before has America seen such an accumulation of wealth in so few of hands. As tens of millions of Americans suffer from the health and economic ravages of this pandemic, a few hundred billionaires add to their massive fortunes. Yet in the course of COVID-19, more than 8 million people have fallen into poverty. Child tax credit payments have stopped. Welfare monies are going unspent as families are continuing to suffer. And consider the fact that on top of all of this, there are 39 million workers making less than a living wage, 14 million families who can't afford water. The nation has spent $21 trillion on war, deportation, detention, mass incarceration, and militarization of our communities since 9/11, but won't find another $1 or $2 trillion over the course of 10 years to invest in childcare and healthcare and climate-resilient jobs and other economic investments in our community. This, and so much more, is why Dr. King's vision of building a beloved community is so prescient. And this, I would say, is why we need and are building a Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. From tens of thousands of families whose water has been shut off in Detroit, to those whose family members have died because of the lack of health care and Medicaid expansion in Vermont and Pennsylvania and North Carolina and Alabama, to thousands of immigrants crying out for hugs, not walls, at the US-Mexico border, to families in Lowndes County and other rural communities across the country who have raw sewage in their yards, tropical diseases that had been eradicated coming back and coming back strong, to hundreds of thousands, really millions of people whose votes have been suppressed because of racist gerrymandering, the ending of early voting and same-day registration, the closing of polling places, to homeless encampments under attack in Washington State and Oregon and my own state of New York. There is a cry. We want to be free. We need a moral revival to make this country great for so many whom it has never been. There's a moral movement afoot in this country, with poor people in the lead. And we know from history when those most impacted by injustice band together with moral leaders and clergy and activists and people of conscience and people of faith and people not of faith, that is when change happens. That's when a nation, a world gets better for everyone, not just a select few. So we launched the Poor People's Campaign 5 years ago with an understanding that we must simultaneously address 5 interlocking injustices: systemic racism, ecological devastation, systemic poverty, the war economy, and this distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism. And we have said that if we don't resolve all of these injustices, we can't resolve any one of them. We have to resolve all of them together in an intersectional movement. And we can see many of these different manifestations here in Indiana. The pandemic of COVID-19 actually is a stark example. COVID has revealed its worsened, deeper and broader economic and social emergencies that we've been confronting for many years. Emergencies caused by the lack of health care, the lack of affordable housing, living wages, labor rights, voting rights, environmental protections. Emergencies caused by war and police violence, a criminal injustice system, and policy violence that kills us all. For years, poor and dispossessed people, people of faith and conscience, teachers, organizers, activists have been ringing the alarm on these emergencies, offering solutions, taking direct action. But in response, those in positions of political and economic and moral authority have committed the crime denounced by prophets throughout the ages. As Jeremiah 6 tells us, they have treated the wounds of my people as if they were not serious, saying peace, peace, when there is no peace. Echoing Jeremiah's accusation of those who cry peace when there is no peace, the prophet Ezekiel compares society, worlds that address or fail to address public health crises or climate crises or the crisis of an impoverished democracy to covering a flimsy wall with plaster. Ezekiel 13 says, I will throw down the wall that you dabbed with plaster. I will raise it to the ground so that its foundations is exposed. When it falls, you shall perish. In the midst, then you shall know that I am the Lord. This is the truth of pandemics, of disasters in the Bible, including plagues. They tear down the flimsy, whitewashed walls of false narratives to expose foundations of injustice. Before such pandemics, God always sends prophets, often sick and poor people themselves, to tell the powerful to reject wickedness, to stop oppressing the poor, to turn toward justice. But when that vision, that action isn't enough, when the powerful double down on inequality and violence and exploitation, that's when we see plagues. The Poor People's Campaign just launched a study, a report. It's been issued by us and the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and it's called the Poor People's Pandemic Report. It connects data about COVID deaths at a county level and looks at other demographic information at the same time. And what we show in this report is that poor counties all across this country, including here in Indiana, have experienced twice the number of deaths from COVID-19 as higher ones, and up to 5 times at the deadliest waves of COVID. Indeed, COVID, because of the pre-existing conditions of racism and poverty and low wages and the lack of health care, is a poor people's pandemic. Exposes the depth of racism and poverty and ecological devastation that preceded and has only been worsened through this pandemic. Over the past couple of years, we've heard many stories, story after story, about how COVID-19 is a great equalizer, that how pandemics, plagues, they don't discriminate. But this report shows that maybe a virus can't discriminate, but our society does it all the time. It should be a wake-up call for a society that has become accustomed to death, especially when it's the death of poor people. And what's important about this report is it says that the devastation and death wrought by COVID isn't just about vaccine status. It's not just about culture wars. It's about the lack of health care. It's about poisoned water. It's about poverty and low wages. It's about the fact that we had 700 people a day dying from poverty and inequality in a country that throws out more food than it takes to feed everybody in this country and the world whole over. When we don't have a scarcity of resources, but we surely have a scarcity of political will and moral consciousness as a nation to address injustice. When we hold up this collective mirror, we see a nation that had 87 million people uninsured and underinsured. We see millions of workers that still have not seen a wage raise despite being called now essential. They can't afford the essentials of life. We see a country that is okay somehow with 52% of our kids going to bed in homes that don't have enough food. Is it a surprise that then COVID has just wreaked this kind of havoc? Disrupted people's lives? It's not. Because people's lives don't seem to matter. But my message today is actually not about despair. It's about hope. Hope in hard times, hard places. It's about a movement that's building to change all of this. Because from Alaska to Alabama, from the Bronx to the border, people are actually coming together. Poor People's Campaign leaders understand that we're at a critical juncture in the nation, and that a movement has the potential to unite all of our struggles reconstruct society from the ground up around the needs of everybody. Now, a lot of folks will say, well, you're just talking about idealism. Your demands are too ambitious. You're politically impossible and just too expensive. But this is just not true. The benefits of actually raising wages and providing health care and addressing child poverty and turning our war economy into a peace economy, guess what? Those costs are affordable. Child poverty cost the United States last year $1 trillion. Unstable housing cost $111 billion. The amount the government subsidizes for the low wages that corporations like Walmart and Amazon and Starbucks pay to their workers is $150 billion every year. But if our nation were to have a moral revolution of values and put the needs, the demands of the poor, the planet, at the center of our budget, guess what? Then this would redound to the benefit of everyone. If we raise the federal minimum wage to a living wage, we would have $400 billion in our communities right now, circulating, helping small businesses, helping communities, helping schools, helping libraries. If we had a more fair taxation system, we'd have $866 billion more a year to spend on the kinds of things that matter to our communities. If we actually invested in climate-resilient jobs and a clean energy transition, not only do we save $7 on the dollar to military jobs, it would just come back and build and mean our society would be healthier and happier. In this, the richest country in the world, we have the resources. And we know this from social science and from the statistics that I'm saying, but we also know it from the Bible. Deuteronomy says that if we forgive debts and we increase programs of social uplift, if we pay workers a living wage, and if we release those oppressed and enslaved to oppression and poverty, and when we lend out money that we might never see again, guess what? Your society flourishes. Now, that's not what we hear in these yet-to-be United States, but it is the case. God does not ordain poverty. The poor will only be with us as long as we're being disobedient to a system and a society of justice. Poverty is a people's creation. It's a creation of immoral budgets, unjust policies, and so we have the power to choose to end it. And so let's talk a little bit about that power. I want to tell you about some of the folks that are building this work. In Flint and Detroit, Michigan, there are folks that have been organizing for water affordability who put year after year after year the crisis of leaded water on the map. And guess what? Because of their organizing, not just the pundits, not just the media makers, not just the politicians, because of poor moms in Flint and Detroit, $15 billion are going to make sure that across this country there's no more lead pipes. That's the power of poor people. That's the power of organizing. That's the power of movement. In Oak Flat, Arizona, the Apache Stronghold there is fighting a multinational copper plant and corporation. But they've been able to win the alliance, the support of people, indigenous tribes, and other folks from across the country and world. And now, if they destroy the most sacred land of the Apache people, they will have to do so with the whole world watching. And that itself is a victory. In Union Hill, Virginia, in Memphis, Tennessee, community leaders, poor folk, were able to come together, band together, organize incredible campaigns against pipelines, the Atlantic pipeline, the Bahalia pipeline. And they connected up with Buddhists and Christians and Jews and said, we are not going to allow our environment to be degraded and for poor people's lives to be sacrificed on an altar of greed. And guess what? They blocked both of those pipelines despite the fossil fuel companies pouring in billions and billions of dollars, the power of poor people organizing. That has changed things. And in Cancer Alley, Louisiana, there are hundreds of petrochemical companies that inhabit that strip all the way from New Orleans to Baton Rouge. They have some of the highest rates of cancer in the entire country. But leaders from Rise St. James, folks with the Louisiana Poor People's Campaign, they've been able to stop the further development of chemical companies coming in. And in their organizing, in their protesting, they sing out, "Victory is mine. Victory is mine." We told Formosa, we told Exxon, we told BP to get thee behind, because victory today is mine. So these victories, these stories of communities coming together, banding together, and putting forward a vision of earth justice, of economic justice, of racial justice, of global justice. These are the communities that will be highlighted when the Poor People's Campaign gathers in June in Washington, D.C. for a mass poor people and low-wage workers assembly, a moral march on Washington and to the polls. This moment means that we have to come together. We need to declare, as Patty sang with us, that somebody's been hurting our people. Somebody's been poisoning the water. Somebody's been evicting our families. Somebody's been destroying the earth. And it's gone on far too long. It's gone on far too long. It's gone on far too long. And we won't be silent anymore. So I want everybody here to consider joining us in Washington, D.C. If you've been to D.C. for protests before, bring some more folks. If you've never thought about getting on a bus and driving from Fort Wayne, Indiana to Washington, D.C., you should be there in the numbers as the saints go marching in, because we say it's time to declare that life overcomes death. And it is in our power. If we live in 2022 and there's folks who are struggling with environmental degradation and militarism and poverty and racism, it is our responsibility. It is our duty to each other to come together and to organize. And so I hope you all will join us in June. I hope that you'll get involved in the Poor People's Campaign here in Indiana. I hope you'll continue to build the Center for Middle East Peace and continue to learn about all of these issues and how they connect and intersect and how they do not have to be. We can indeed save the planet and everything living in and on it. And we can do so because those who have come before and the future generations that will come after are depending on us. So thank you.
Well, wow. We have time for some questions. And we have Linda with the microphone, so who would like to start? Tony, please.
Yes.
Tony, wait for the microphone, man.
I'm sorry, man. Yes. I just don't understand, but what about these poor people in the world? Because in Fort Wayne, I always see these, because we want our voice to be heard. Some of these government people in the office really like to turn us away because we think we're important around. They think they're important. They think that we're not important around it. They want built these buildings and built these expensive apartments that we can't afford, and they leave us out on the street. they have these these big fundraising events, like these. Not everybody had kind of money to pay the rent. They leave us out in the prodigy. We don't like to be treated like that, you know.
Thanks, Tony. It's a great question.
Yeah, so again, I know we're people of many different faiths here, but what that question and what that point brought up for me was one of my favorite parables in the Bible. And it's the parable of the persistent widow. And what it says in that story in Luke 19 is that there, in a certain town, maybe it's Fort Wayne, was a judge, a political authority. And they say that that judge, that political authority leader, didn't give a damn about other human beings and didn't even fear God. And so that political leader would pass policy after policy that just hurt the poor. But then there was this woman, this widow, who kept on coming and demanding justice, not just for her and her family, but for her community. And it says that she kept on coming. And one of the things that's kind of amazing to me about this parable is it says that the judge, the kind of political leader, it's not that he has a aha moment and realizes that he's been doing the wrong thing the whole time. It's not that he all of a sudden is won over with a sense of justice and righteousness. But he says, I think this woman is going to keep on coming and coming. And she's going to give me a political black eye. And so what happens from that is because of the organizing of those that are most impacted, coming and coming, returning and returning, being persistent in the demand for justice, that justice is served. So it's not waiting for those that are gentrifying and developing housing developments or putting in forth new business improvement districts. It's not those folk that are going to come up with the solutions to the problems our society is facing. It's when people, like all of us that are gathered here today, come together and keep on insisting it does not have to be this way. And so to me, I go back to that parable all the time because I think it grounds us in a sense of how we can achieve change and how change has always been achieved. If we look from abolition to the labor struggles of the 20s and 30s to what now is happening all across the country with Starbucks workers organizing, is the persistence of those who are most impacted, saying it does not have to be.
Yes, John, please.
Thank you. I have two questions. The first one is a quick question. I want to ask you to take 60 seconds to describe what the world will be like after your cause prevails. And that's my first question. My second question is a little more complex.
Because that's simple.
I hope you can remember the first question. It's probably more important. My second question arises out of my life experience. I'm 74 years old. I realized when I turned 74, I'm no longer even a young 70th. And I've spent my whole adult life being in the struggle, war resistance, peace. We started a Center for Nonviolence in Fort Wayne, premised on ending militarism, racism, homophobia, and domestic violence, and seeing the linkages between all of that and poverty. And there's, in the shadow place in my spirit, there's a voice now in the face of this Ukrainian invasion that says, I am glad we have a military-industrial complex to counter Putin. And I know that voice is linked to perhaps a predominant philosophy in the United States. I know it's antithetical to everything I've ever stood for, but I need help from you to find language and vision to counter that voice in my own soul as well as in our community.
Yeah, so I would say neither of those questions are simple. But I deeply appreciate both. So I might take up the question of war first. I was really appalled this week to read in the Wall Street Journal that the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal was arguing to double the U.S. military budget when we have the largest military budget this year already, with $30 million in it that the Pentagon didn't even ask for. And what I do know from looking, and I'm sure you know this better and have more of the analysis and understanding, but I do know that war in all its forms is an enemy of the poor everywhere. And so that if we get to 1.6 trillion of a military budget, if the Wall Street Journal wins, we know that means, no relief for student debt. That means no expanded health care. We know it means, wage raises for people. It means no expanded health care. And it's not that we can't afford those things, but our society tends to prefer and defer to the military-industrial complex. We also know that the people of Russia and the people of the Ukraine are devastated and being further devastated right now by this war. And I think it is hard to think about how do you stop a Christian nationalist and kind of demagogue in Putin. But also, how do we see a world that does not move towards the kind of nuclear annihilation that we have never been closer to? And the fact that they have these new weapons and Russia is threatening to use them that can nuclearly annihilate a place the size of Texas or multiple Indianas together. And that the counter to that is to build up the arms race more. It does not make us any safer. And so, what has always been needed for peace is for people in societies to come together and advocate for it. And people are doing that in Russia. People are doing that in the Ukraine. People are doing that across the world. And because of years and years of the kind of degradation of life in this country and around the world, I fear for where we're headed. And yes, being able to arm and further, send weapons throughout the world, it's kind of like going back to the Bible, and Dr. King, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth until the world is blind. And so how do we kind of cease this kind of warring madness, I think, is a question, but I also think it's directly connected to everything we're talking about at this conference today, which is it requires people in our communities across this country and across the world to seek peace and work for justice. And so I'm terrified about the situation of the world right now. And I mourn every day for the people of Ukraine and the people in Russia whose name this war is being fought out in. And I know that just like the peace movement in this country has often said, not in our name, there are just so many folks that are resisting the kind of drive to war all over the world. And if we don't kind of see the connection to oil and fossil fuels and wealth and greed, and if we don't see this kind of Christian nationalistic project that Putin has, and see how it's connected to Donald Trump and the project that he has, and it's not like a simple solution, but military solutions are also not the solution, and I think we are seeing that right now, and so then to think a little bit about what's the world going to look like when we are able to build this powerful enough movement. I think there's ways that we can't even fully imagine it, but I do see glimpses of that in the kind of resistance that people are doing in Russia, in Ukraine to war, in the kind of mutual solidarity feeding that people are doing in this country, in people coming together across all the lines that divide us, and actually finding common cause amongst each other. And so I can't in 60 seconds, point out what that world will be, but I've definitely seen, from the hills to the hollers of West Virginia when I was marching there last week, this kind of moral movement where people of great diversity who, we're told on the TV have nothing in common are finding that we actually are united. That might be what King's beloved community was. It might be what the kind of church and community that I found amongst people organizing, poor folk organizing in this country is, and I think it's a kind of a dream that we can achieve, but only if we kind of come together in the way that I see people coming together, and so I'll be curious to hear examples that people have here. I'm sure there are many of little microcosms of that kind of, as the Bible calls it, jubilee, where people come together and proclaim that life is sacred and that we can take care of each other and keep on going from there.
The long way around. I am.
Thanks. As you said earlier, the Poor People's Campaign was restarted in 2017, so it's been 5 years of work, and as many know, in 2018 there was the big push in probably 35, 40 state capitals with 6 weeks of direct action, civil disobedience, and so forth. And I'm just curious of what are the hopes of for a national mobilization in June of 2022, and what you're hoping to see from that.
Yeah, I mean, so indeed, the Poor People's Campaign launched with the largest and most expansive wave of nonviolent civil disobedience in the 21st century, and the way it was done in about 40 state capitals, 35, 40, like you said, was never done in U.S. history before. And what that did was seed these coordinating committees in about 40 states. Pretty soon will be all 50 states of impacted folks and clergy and activists and advocates who now thousands of people wake up every day trying to think about how do we build a moral movement from the ground up. And we had plans in 2020 before the pandemic hit to have basically the assembly in March that we're planning now, and we had to move it online, and we had there the largest online gathering of poor and low-income people. We had about 3 million people join, and folks got to see people like themselves and nothing like themselves, all kind of coming forward with their stories and their solutions to the problems that are plaguing society. But it's not the same to do that online. not the same to watch that, on your computer or on your phone, whether at a homeless encampment or in the comforts of a beautiful house. And for those in power to see that people are organizing and coming together and actually building something, big and powerful. So I think the hopes is that when we look at history, there haven't been movements of transformational change that have not included what is often understood as kind of generationally transformative mobilizations and events. So it's not to say that all of the work is about, going to one event. And we're very clear that this is not like a day. It's a kind of declaration of the kind of power that's building. But also, when you pull people together and you have folks from every state, and you have, folks that are without health care, without water, but also folks that have lots of resources, but see that it's just not right to have society the way it is, and to pull people together and to kind of, declare that we're going to keep on building this. I mean, again, if we look at other moments in history, but then also, in our lives today, that kind of building up of power and changing the narrative is what it takes to be able to keep on kind of building for change. And a favorite quote of mine from Dr. King is that power for poor people will really mean having the assertiveness, the aggressiveness, and the ability to make those in power say yes when they may be desirous of saying no. And I think over the last couple years, over the last couple decades, we've gotten used to a lot of no. No, we can't raise wages. No, we can't cut the military budget. No, we can't expel health care in a public health crisis. No, we can't allow for kids to get a child tax credit without their parents working, crap jobs. But what it takes is to kind of come together and declare yes. Again, it's not waiting for those in power to do the right thing, but instead, showing that, as we've been saying on this mobilization tour that we're on, we are ready. We're ready. We're ready for a change. We're ready. We're ready. We're ready. Here we come. And so, Washington, D.C., Congress, the White House, here we come.
We have time for a couple more brief questions. Yeah, please, Steve.
It's been a while ago, but I watched a video where Reverend Barber, I think you and several others were in front of members of Congress. Remember that? And you even had a budget. You had it all figured out how this would be budgeted and it would come out and we could do this. And I just felt like they were listening politely, but they really didn't give a crap. How did you feel about that? And is that part of your plan again? Or, it was just discouraging to me. And I don't know how, you were there, so could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so in a number of different situations, the Poor People's Campaign has been able to do these congressional hearings. I think the one you're talking about is when we kind of marched into the House Budget Committee and presented our Poor People's Moral Budget. And what we said was, if we enacted a fair taxation system, if we cut the military budget in half, and if we invested in programs of healthcare and social uplift and investments around water and infrastructure, all of this, that indeed we could achieve everything on our agenda and more. And it was, to me, really fascinating. Not in a happy way, but really interesting to see the response. So the first kind of answer was to join the military. That the best way of addressing poverty and low wages and poverty in communities was for folks to join the military. And that was, I mean, not shocking. We basically don't have a draft, but we have a poverty draft already, much of the way that poor folk are able to, go to college or get provided for their families because of the lack of living wage jobs is that many poor people enlist. But then if we look at the statistics and the figures, many folks in the military are so poor that their families have to rely on public assistance, and 40% of adults who are homeless are veterans. So clearly we don't actually, clearly the military, for lots of reasons, is not a path to getting out of poverty. The next kind of thing that was thrown at us was that, if people just, worked harder and kind of prayed more, then everything would be okay. And one of the highlights of that hearing, and I actually encourage folks, you can find it and I could send it around too, because it's a really interesting study in kind of the mental terrain of many of our elected officials. So you had this representative from Ohio, not Indiana, but maybe close enough, say to us, including Reverend Barbara and myself, who are wearing these stoles and wearing our clerical garb, that he's read the Bible and he considers himself a Christian, and that nowhere in the Bible that he's read does he see anywhere where Jesus says to Caesar to help the poor. So Reverend Barbara's response was immediate and awesome, where he says, well, I think it's really interesting that as a Christian, you're aligning yourself with Caesar. You're basically articulating a reality that I'm sure you believe, but most people in power don't really admit to. And then he kind of passed it to me, and I said, should we actually look at the Bible a little bit in terms of all the places that Jesus says to Caesar and to the ruling authorities of the Roman Empire, not of Jewish synagogues, but of the empire, that indeed, when you neglect to feed and clothe and house me, then that you're doing that to God, that when the Spirit of God is upon me. He has anointed me to preach good news, not the bad news of eviction and cutting of programs to the Potocos, those made poor by policy injustice, and just continued on and on and on, right? But it was so interesting that most of these representatives on both sides of the aisle had to admit that they were aware of the level of poverty in their communities. But instead, as a bunch of the folks that were with us who are low-wage workers who said, if I did that bad of a job at my employment, I would be fired. Like, you just admitted that all of these people in your constituency, don't have living wages, don't have health care, and you're just fine with that. Like, if I don't flip the burger right, I lose my job. But you seem to be able to, thrive in this position. But despite people being aware, despite having these arguments of the military-industrial complex and theology, bad theology being the way out, that was what they had to fall back on, which to me shows the strength of a movement and of the arguments and of the budget that we were presenting. Because if you have to fall back on these tired old stereotypes and inaccuracies and theoretical theologies, and you can't just actually say, we don't want to do it, which might be what's happening, then you have the potential to change things, right? Because it's not just, as Dr. Barber often says, the right thing to do, but it's constitutionally consistent, economically sane, and morally consistent to to do this. And so we're not talking about some radical ideas out there. We're talking about, how do we save the heart and soul of the nation and of the democracy, and for those in power to then know about these issues and then to shy away just means that we have to keep coming back, which we surely intend to do. Yes, indeed. In that bus.
We do have time for one last question. There's a question out there. Yes, please, go ahead. Wait for the microphone.
Thank you so much for coming to Fort Wayne. My question is, how do you go about, if you are in a position to, where you're faced with like challenges that are beyond your own kind of purview or your own authority? I mean, we often see with elected officials where they have authority over a certain part, but they can't affect something else. I mean, for example, the Puerto Rico ruling, like 8-1, them judging on Puerto Rico being treated, differently, and it's like what the law says, versus the law being unjust, how to deal with that. What are your thoughts on officials and people that are in positions where they feel they have to morally compromise because of what's legally expected versus what they think should be?
Yeah, so I think it's really important for us to kind of recognize that poverty and injustice in many manifestations are completely legal in our system, right? But they have been before. And that means that it becomes our duty to resist and organize unjust legal systems and legislation, right? So again, Dr. King is really good on this, and especially the kind of steps of nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience. It's steps, right? So it's not just taking an action one time. It's identifying the problem that you're trying to solve, who has the authority to do something about it, and then continuing to both give people a chance to do the right thing, but then being willing to put yourself out there in direct action, in civil disobedience, in protest of many forms. It doesn't have to be breaking the law, but to kind of show the inconsistency and the unjustness of laws, right? And so, one of the points that Dr. King makes a lot of the time is that, it was illegal in the Holocaust in Germany under Hitler to aid and abet Jewish folk, getting to life and freedom. Just like in abolition in this country, it was illegal to help those enslaved that were running towards freedom. But it doesn't mean that it was right. And so sometimes things are legal and wrong. And so the fact that if I come out of a homeless movement, and one of the contradictions we would raise all the time was that it's perfectly legal to be homeless in this society. When you get illegal is when you decide to move back into houses that you've been evicted from. But moving back into that house might be illegal, but it means I'm gonna live. But staying legal might mean that you're gonna die. And so it to me kind of brings us back to the place, and we all have different roles to play, and we all have different ways, and we need multiple ways of kind of challenging the justness of laws and legislation, but to be able to say, and not direct it just at that police officer or law enforcement, or even at any individual in the political system or legal system, but to see that it's a whole structure, and that structure needs to be transformed and changed. And so, for instance, when we do nonviolent civil disobedience, we're very clear that we're trying to welcome the police officers who are going to arrest us, into the movement, because most of them aren't making living wages. Many of them don't have the kind of health care for their families, and they're just doing what they're supposed to do. But it also is clear to us that staying silent about unjust laws is not an option either, right? And so you can do that in a way where you challenge the justness of law and legislation, and at the same time, don't build a division between you and that person when it's really a larger structural problem.
Let's say thanks to Reverend. Thank you. Reverend Liz will be in the Folsom room to sign copies of her book, We Cry Justice. I'd encourage you to stop in the Folsom room and grab a snack and something to drink on your way home, and especially see the displays. We want to thank the organizations who had displays today. We want to say thank you to Plymouth Church. We want to say thank you to our workshop presenters. And we want to say thank you for coming today, and have a good rest of the afternoon. Thanks, everyone.